Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to talk about evidence of evolution. Evidence laid down by this guy, who you all probably know as Charles Darwin. Who you don't know is this guy over here. This is Alfred Wallace, and these two both came up with the same exact idea that the diversity of life on our planet comes through the process of evolution, and the mechanism by which that occurred is natural selection. Now, why don't any of us know Alfred Wallace? Well, if you're interested in the story of Darwin, a great read would be David Quammen's The Reluctant Mr. Darwin. David Quammen actually lives here in Bozeman. I've met him. He's a fascinating author, but basically lays out the life of Charles Darwin as this scientist who loved to work on the minutiae of science and gather data over years and years and years and years to eventually support his idea, support his theory of natural selection. And he did that. For 30 years, he sat on the idea of evolution and natural selection, and he never published anything until he got a letter from this guy, Alfred Wallace, who'd gone on a similar journey to Southeast Asia, discovered the same exact thing, wrote a letter to Darwin. Darwin freaked out. They publish a letter together, and Darwin kind of gets all his ducks in a row and publishes On the Origin of Species, where he lays out evidence of evolution. Since Darwin started first and had kind of established this theory, first, and he also knew a lot of really powerful people. We remember his name. But it still doesn't take away from his work. It's amazing. So The Origin of Species, basically, he lays out evidence for evolution and then a means by which that occurs, and that is natural selection. So here's him coming up with the idea. So this is in one of his notebooks, and he took copious notes on all of his ideas, was the idea that life started from one common ancestor and it branched into all the forms of life that we have today. He then explained how this could occur, because a number of scientists said this before, and he lays out a real persuasive argument in The Origin of the Species. And so he starts, without talking about nature at all, he starts by talking about something that all of us can see within our lifetime, or at least throughout generations. He starts with the pigeon. And if you look at this pigeon right here, this pigeon was bred selectively by humans to create a number of different pigeons. So let's look at all these different types of pigeons, from this red pigeon to this white pigeon to this really crazy-beaked pigeon. All of these have the same DNA as that original pigeon. Now, there's going to be some variation. That's why we get all these differences. But most people wouldn't think that these all came from that same pigeon. And so that's a great piece of evidence that if we could do this in just hundreds of years using artificial selection, surely we could do this in nature using millions of years. And so then he starts talking about nature. The first thing he talks about is the idea of biogeography. And this is the one thing that struck him, because he went on a 3-year tour where he sailed from Europe. He ended up down here in South America. They bounced around South America. They went across the Galapagos, sailed across the Pacific, went to Australia, went to all of these islands, eventually came back to South America and to Europe. And that whole way he saw life, but he saw life not the same everywhere. In other words, in Australia, he's going to see marsupial mammals. But if you look in North America, we're not going to have any marsupial mammals except for the possum. And so what biogeography is where life is found. And because before Darwin, all scientists believed in special creativity, that God simply placed everything perfectly evolved to where it lived. That's what the scientists believe. And he started to question that when he went to the Galapagos, for example, and found that there were only one type of bird there, the finches. That there were only the tortoises there, but you didn't have mammals, you didn't have goats and pigs, and all those things weren't there naturally. And they also had adapted to each of the individual islands. The natives here could tell them, they could identify what island a tortoise comes from just by the shape of its shell. And you can see right away that there's clear differences between these. In other words, this one right here is the last living tortoise from Pinta Island. This is Lonesome George. He has a really long neck. How did he get a long neck? Not by stretching it, Darwin said, but on Pinta Island, where there's not a lot of vegetation, basically tortoises that had a longer neck were able to get more vegetation, and so their genes were passed on. Likewise, this down here is from Santa Cruz, this tortoise, and so there probably are tortoises born on Santa Cruz that have a really long neck, but predators can eat it because there's plenty of food. The big selective pressure ends up being the predators. And so we have a bell-shaped curve of neck length on tortoises, but it's going to vary depending on what the island is. And so Darwin lays out a compelling argument that life is different no matter where you go, and it has to do with chance and how it got there. It just wasn't just added there. Next, he talks about fossils, and he collected fossils the whole way. That was one of the big things that's brought back all of these fossils to England. And he was able to lay out evolution. He was able to show how certain organisms changed into other organisms. So a great example would be the horse. So the horse essentially went from an animal that's kind of like a deer, where it was living in the forest and it was kind of a browser, and then it moved and over millions of years became a grazer. And you can see that its size got larger and its teeth changed and its legs changed. And so the fossil evidence that Darwin had was not great back then, but it still was compelling enough to make the argument for evolution. Since this time, you can think, we're talking about hundreds of years, we've gathered so many fossils that in science, we've gathered so much evidence, so much fossil evidence, that in science, evolution is pretty much accepted as fact. There's not a lot of scientists who would ever question it. He also talks about homologies. So homologies are going to be characteristics that show similar origins. And so if you look at a human arm or a dog leg or a pigeon arm, a wing, or a whale flipper, you can see that they all have similar bone structure. Even though they do totally different things, this is for swimming and flying and swinging from a tree, they all have the same bone structure. That suggests that they came from the same origins, because you surely could make different ways to make an arm using just bones, but this had a common ancestor, a tetrapod, that shared this, so it was passed on. If you have one of these, I have one of these, a point on my ear. This is called the Darwin's tarbuncle, but basically it is the point at which used to be the mammal tip of their ear, and it's been passed on through time. It doesn't serve a purpose anymore, but it's still there. And so homologies in structures were super important. But what Darwin didn't have is a really thorough understanding of genetics, and he surely didn't have an understanding of DNA. And so DNA, when it comes to evidence of evolution, is the trump card. It is pretty much the definitive piece of evidence that shows us that evolution has occurred. If you don't understand how DNA works, basically it's passed from generation to generation to generation to generation. There are mutations in there which may be selected for or against using nature, but basically that message gets passed from generation to generation to generation. Example is the game of telephone. So in the game of telephone, basically this person tells this person a story, whispers it in their ear, which is passed to the next and passed to the next. And so this is like generation after generation after generation. So if we look through a quick game of telephone, maybe this person says the fat cat ate the rat, and then red says the fat cat ate the rat, but yellow makes a mistake and says the fat car ate the rat. And once we go forward now, that message or that mutation is stuck forever, because we can't go back to that original message. And so DNA holds a fingerprint for how mistakes are made and they're passed through time. And so basically, as more mutations come, let's go back for just a second, as more mutations come, we can actually trace through that message and we can figure out where those mutations started. We also are starting to figure out that you can use the rate of those mutations, and so we can actually add time to it. And so we could say right here is that magenta or that purple mutation, which would be way up here. And so basically what you can do is you can look at one of these specific messages, the fat car ate the bat. We could say, okay, well, it has this mutation here. It has this yellow mutation, so we know that it's at least past this. It also has the red mutation, so we know it's at least past this, so we could identify it as this person. Likewise, with life, we can compare the DNA of a human to a chimpanzee, to an orangutan, to a gorilla, to a yeast, since we all share common ancestry with all life on our planet, and we can say who's related to whom. And so that's a really compelling piece of evidence that shows that not only is evolution correct, but we can also measure the rate at which it occurs and who's related to whom. And so again, that's a long story, but it's also important because it guides all of biology, and I hope that's helpful.